Hi and welcome to my channel. Today I am doing a speed paint for the July Discord challenge. It was a representation of a dream we'd had with a random color palette for a technical aspect, and I actually recorded my sketching process this time. So I went into this already knowing what my random color palette was and what aspects of my dream that I wanted to represent. So what I wanted to do with the sketch was break it up into layers. So I have one element on each layer, and it made it a little bit easier to work with when it came to actually adding in flat colors down the road and separating everything out. One thing with my color palette was it had a lot of earth tones, and in this specific dream there was a giant tree that grew in the backyard of my childhood home that I climbed, and I met a giant man. So I thought, well, earth tones, the browns, would be really good to represent the trees. And I also got a kind of a saturated purple and a saturated red. So I thought that would be really good to make it seem more dreamlike and less realistic, because obviously crazy things happen in dreams and it's not something that you're going to want to make uber realistic unless it's a realistic dream, which in my case it was absolutely not. So I've mentioned this in other videos before, but when I start to draw out figures, I just draw like the silhouette of the shape and I break it down into just a silhouette, and I go in later and actually, like now, start adding details into the character, like the hair and what the clothes look like, and actually make it more of a character and less like a silhouette. And then I even erase more and add more details in with the line art and coloring and so on. So that would be childhood Cherry in a tree. Fun times. I've never climbed a tree in my life. I'm terribly afraid of heights, but apparently I'm a daredevil in my dream, so that's fine. There's the color palette, as you can see. One thing about this is the color palette I chose was a lot more saturated than colors that I like to use, so that actually was a pretty big challenge for me. The other thing I wanted to do, I didn't want to actually limit myself to just those colors. I just wanted them to be the main focus of the image. I wanted to separate it a lot with like the greens to balance out the purples, and then I have, I wanted a realistic representation of what I would have worn in this time of my life. So I went with it's a band t-shirt. I didn't really have an opportunity to add a band logo to it because of the direction that I'm facing, but band t-shirt, little skirt, tights, Converse shoes, scene bean, I guess. We don't have to talk about high school, it's fine. One thing I wanted to try to do with the tree was, part of my dream was that I was on a mission to steal batteries, so I thought it would be interesting if the tree grew batteries instead of leaves, but I didn't like how that was turning out, so it just ended up being a good old everyday huge oak tree that grows in your backyard for no reason. The giant man in my dream actually was very friendly, and he wasn't scary or intimidating in any way. And then I drew him, and I may have dreamed about Slenderman in high school actually, and I don't want to think about that too much. So he's just a friendly giant man that likes to watch teenage girls climb trees, and that's it, and nothing else is weird about that. I went very heavy on my line art pen this time, which is not something I usually do. I like my lines thinner because I always go in and I always change the color towards the end so that they're not so obvious. But my thought was maybe this is something a little bit different than what I normally do, so I could go a little bit thicker with the line art pen this time. And I liked the effect that it gave me, to a point where I thought, well, maybe I'll just leave this as line art, until I remembered, oh right, color palette. I thought about trying to change the line art colors to make it just line art, but I wasn't so sure that was the direction I wanted to go with it. So I just left the line art as it was, and I came back and changed it later like I usually did. But if I had to go back and do it again, I think I would make it just a little bit thinner, or maybe just a little bit more opaque, not so dark. Another thing that I try to be conscious of is the line weight for different layers that I'm drawing in. I try to make it thinner for every layer that goes back in space, so that not everything has the same line weight. I also try to be careful with my pen pressure, but I think where I drew on paper for years, I struggle a little bit with actually using the pen pressure on the tablet, just because I'm just how I learned to draw, I guess. But the other thing that I wanted to be conscious of was using a thinner line weight for the clusters of leaves or on the tree, because when I go back and I change the line weight color, I don't want there to be a hard line there at all. And also I try to shade things like that with a textured brush and not just a solid brush, so that it gives it a little bit of a different feel to it. And here is my friendly man, who was definitely friendly and not at all terrifying, and I really tried to make him look nice. Like, as much as I could, I tried to make him look nice, and I think he looks as nice as he can for a giant man watching a teenage girl climb a tree, I guess. And I tried to give him a nice dapper suit, because you know, you can always trust people's suits, right? Right? Yeah. So anyway, with the color palette that I had, I think I mentioned before, I wanted to use the earth tones for like the tree, and the purple I thought would be a good idea to sort of make the houses seem like they're in the distance. And I used the red that was supposed to be sort of sunsetty, but I didn't want to stray too far from the color palette, so I offset it some with the pink that I used for my skirt later on. And it helped make it look nicer, but I think it also made it look a little more apocalyptic. So my goal was to actually draw a nice dream that I had, and I think I made it a lot more nightmarish than it needed to be. Another thing that I experimented with was actually using the color palette I had and using the colors on different layer modes to get different effects with the colors. I used the purple after I get all the base colors in. I use the purple as like a dreamy haze over top of everything, and I use that on a different layer mode so that it seemed a little bit brighter, but it is absolutely the purple that I pulled from the color palette that I had. And as I mentioned before, there is the pink that I used on the skirt, and just going in and filling everything in with a base color before adding in any kind of details or shading or anything like that. Okay, so I mentioned before that in a different video that I like to go in and do any kind of detail work before I go in and do any of the shading, and this is where I start to do that. I mentioned in my banner video that I really liked plaid, and apparently that has carried through from way back because I was wearing plaid even in high school. But I do that, and I add in some lighting for the houses just so they seem I think that helped a little bit with setting them further back in the distance and lower down. And then this is adding in the dreamy haze to make everything seem mysterious, I suppose. So I used the mid-tone brown and the purple and red in the main color palette, and there were two more earthy tones that I didn't work in anywhere, so my thought was to use them on different layer modes to actually shade and highlight with. And I wasn't really sure how it was going to work out, but I definitely was pleased with the shading color. The lighter earth tone, I don't think it provided much in terms of contrast, but it worked for what I used it for. I usually like to use complementary colors for shading and highlighting, but for the challenge of the color palette, that's what I tried to do. I used a leafy texture brush to add shading towards the top of the tree to suggest that there were leaves higher up, and also to suggest that the cluster at the ends of the branches were not just shapeless masses. I usually use that to try to balance that out a little bit, and I did this more cell shaded than I usually do. Usually I will block in the color and take a watercolor brush and blend it a bit. I did that a little bit, but not as hard as I usually do. I could kind of tell this was going a little bit more in a little bit of a different direction than I usually draw. So I kind of embraced that as opposed to fight against it. Some things that, like the shading underneath the hat, needed more blending than a lot of other areas. But I do blend it some because I can't stand for I don't like the hard line. I don't know why. I just don't. But I didn't render this a whole lot. I didn't put a lot of time into shading and highlighting it, just where everything was so off the wall as it was. So I sort of wanted to leave it a bit out of my usual style. I think that it helped suggest it was a dream a little bit more. So just adding in a little bit of highlight with the lighter of the two earthy tones, just to add a little bit of reflection off of things. And then the last thing that I do when I finish something up is I lock the opacity on my line art layers, and I usually go over the line art with a different color other than black, just to help blend it into the image a little bit more. I tried using some of the earth or the color palette colors for everything to try to unify it a little bit more that way, but it worked in some places and not for others. So I just sort of applied it as I felt it was necessary. I definitely used the greens for like the bushes and things like that, just to help blend those in and give those a little bit of organic form and not locked into one shape. And it's finished. So thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe for new videos every other Tuesday, and I'll see you next time.